Want to get started tonight, but just we want to have a review. We want to have a review of where we've been and where we're going. We've titled this series, these series of conversations that we're having, as Kingdom Come. And of course, the right question to ask would be, what kingdom? What kingdom are we talking about? And the kingdom that we're talking about is Jesus' kingdom. And we've stepped into this tension that we see through our screens, we see in our city, that the world we want, the world we long for, is not the world that we're living in. And when we say Jesus' kingdom, we're acknowledging a reality that we're heading towards as followers of Jesus. But here's what we said, remember, week one, is that we said two things. We said it's impossible to get the kingdom without the king. That if we want to be in a city of justice and righteousness and equity and glory, enjoyment, pleasure, if we truly want that, that's the king that we're really longing for. But we said that there's also something that we didn't know as human beings, is that God has created each and every single one of us here tonight who's watching this, each and every single human being on the face of this earth, he has given dignity to. We talked about the difference between God speaking reality into existence. Gravity, he spoke it was there. Relativity, he spoke it, and it was there. All of these things, but then when it came to making human beings, God rolled up his sleeves, and the Genesis tells us that he began to form man from the dust of the ground, that God did something different with human beings, and that difference is what gives us dignity. And last week, Nate led us into a conversation that each and every single one of us, as an image bearer, right? We bear the image of God. That we are his statues, representing his rule and reign in the earth. But the problem is that we have chosen, right, to take control of the kingdom without the king. And so the first place that we see this brokenness start to show up is unique just to each of every single one of us individually in our sexuality. And Nate did an amazing job last week, like he said, kind of skipping a stone across a very big lake, about what it means to be human, what it means to be a sexual being. We talked about how God loves that. The first command he gave to human beings was to go have sex, to be fruitful and to multiply. And so we started by talking about what God intended it to be, but then also talking about the simple fact that each and every single one of us are sexual sinners, have broken sexuality, that God, when we acknowledge his kingdom, we begin to receive the power to live out his design for our sexuality. And so today, though, we're taking a step further. And I want to say this very clearly. We didn't choose these 4 topics from out of a hat and said, hey, how can we cause the most disunity possible? How can we be the most confusing we possibly could? No, what we are doing, right, is we are threading the image of God, this incredible doctrine that everyone has dignity and value. And we're connecting that to the kingdom of God, that Jesus is our king, and we as his image bearers are invited to rule with him. And we're threading these two things together through 4 issues. And these issues are sexuality. Today we're going to talk about God's heart for the poor and poverty. Next week, we're going to be talking about life. So not just pro-choice and pro-life, but womb-to-tomb life. And then finally, we're going to have a conversation about ethnicity, about ethnic reconciliation. And we've just added a special 6th week that I'm just going to leave sit right there. So you got to come. So tonight, we're going to take a journey to talk about God's heart for the poor. And so as we start this conversation, I wanted to start with a framework so we all kind of know what we're not going to talk about and where we're not heading. Is that many of you in this room are probably familiar with a Christian ethic of how we're supposed to relate to our stuff and our things. And we are going to talk about that. But I'm starting us off tonight with a conversation that this is about God's kingdom and the dignity of human beings in poverty. So, I want to take you guys on a journey. If you know me, you know that not only did I live in New Orleans for 5 years, but I really loved living in New Orleans for 5 years, okay? If I had to give out a nickel for every single time I said, in New Orleans, you all would be very rich. Okay, let's just put it that way. There is a sign in my living room. You guys know this that have been to our house that says, "Do you know what it means to miss New Orleans?" Okay, and that's from a local New Orleans artist. Like we bought that as kind of like a horcrux, right? To like put our souls in, like we're going away, we're leaving New Orleans, and we love the city. But something profound and tragic happened in the city of New Orleans 15 years ago next month. And so what I want to do, you all are familiar maybe with Hurricane Katrina. I'm talking to people in the room who were probably somewhere between 5, 10, 11 years old when this went down. And so what I want to do is I want to start our conversation here about God's heart for the poor. What happened in Hurricane Katrina was essentially a hurricane hit the Gulf Coast, Mississippi, Alabama, New Orleans. But what happened in New Orleans was that its infrastructure began to collapse and the city was flooded. I have a picture of the city post-storm that I want to show you guys here. 70% of all housing in the city, 70% was damaged. This shot, I don't know if you can really tell, I don't want to get into it because the infrastructure concept is fascinating, but what you need to recognize is that these homes right here represent some of actually the poorest neighborhoods in New Orleans. Represent the 9th Ward. Now, my wife and I, we moved to New Orleans in 2012. This was taken in August and September of 2005. When we got off our exit on the interstate, it looked like it happened yesterday. In fact, you can still drive around New Orleans today in the lower 9th Ward and in some of the neighborhoods that were occupied by the poor of the city. And this is what you'll see. You will see the houses there that looks just like this. And on those houses, some of you can probably make out the yellow X that's on that side. That's what the search crews would go through when they were searching houses. They would mark an X to mark that it had been searched. And then they would also mark particular things if they found dead animals. And they wrote how many dead bodies they found in the house. Now, all of America watched this and processed this through screens. And very quickly, I was 15 when this happened, but very quickly, it became very political. How is aid getting there? How are people being helped there? But I want to start tonight by just making a simple statement that when we are talking about God's heart for the poor, we have to recognize that yes, it is an economic conversation, but we are dealing with people. And so I want to share one of the accounts, because what happened in the city was that as the storm was coming, you got to make a decision. If you could get out, you could leave. But many people could not leave. Many of the poor in the city could not leave. And what ended up happening was they went to the Saints football stadium. This is what one of the survivors said. That we started to see the mayor say that if you could get out, it was too late. And that if you needed a place to go, you could go to the Superdome. But we started to watch it rain and suddenly realized our mom was at work and we didn't have a car. Their mom was at work and they didn't have a car. An option available to most all of you in this room, unless you walked here, was not available to this 15-year-old and her 7-year-old sister. And they met their mom at the Superdome. This is the aftermath. The report that I read, the article that I read years later that was tracking the stories of survivors of Hurricane Katrina in the city said that they could not find enough records to definitively say how many people died in the Superdome. That they talked about that at first it was a party. That everyone they knew from their neighborhood was there, but they said by 2 a.m., 2 in the morning, it became a third world country. Last week we talked about trauma. What they described in their experience in the Superdome was nothing short of traumatic. From my time in the city, I don't need an article to tell you this. From my time in the city, people shared stories of people going up to the upper bowl and dropping off, jumping off, because mentally they were breaking. That there was an epidemic of sexual assault every night happening in the halls. And we're talking about young mothers with their children waiting for buses to come. And so while the world outside made this a political issue, real people whose circumstances prevented them from leaving were forced to go through one of the most traumatic experiences and traumatic natural disasters in all of American history. Now, you may be sitting here and you maybe have one of two reactions. Some of you right now hear this and you're hurt. You genuinely empathize with not only the city of New Orleans, but with the people who couldn't leave the city. With the people who couldn't even make the choice to get out, even if they wanted to. But there's another reaction that I think is probably in this room. And it's a deep current that's probably running in a lot of our hearts. And it's saying this: maybe you're hurt, yes, but more deeply, you're hoping that one day you'll make enough money that you'll never have to be put in a situation where you have no choice but to stay. Some of you are hurting, but many of us are hoping, I hope I never have to be in that kind of situation. And would you be wrong in hoping that? Hoping to be safe and avoid that? No. But what I'm saying is that if your first reaction is for self-preservation, that this night about God's heart for the poor is for you. And the question I have for you is actually a question that Jesus asked a religious leader at the time. And it's a very simple question. Do you see the poor? Do you see the poor? And for many of us in Fredericksburg, let's be real. Seeing poverty for many of us just looks like seeing someone asking for money on the side of a road in a median. But tonight, I hope that you hear Jesus' heart, that poverty is deeper than that. And that also the people in poverty have more dignity than we afford them. Do you see the poor? Join me with Jesus in Luke chapter 12. Any answer to this question of, do I see the poor? Do the poor have dignity in my life? We ultimately remember the framework, right? We're talking about, what does Jesus' kingdom say? What does our king say about his heart for the poor? We got any brothers and sisters in here tonight? Any siblings in the house? Okay. If you as a sibling could bring Jesus in to solve your sibling rivalry, would you not? I've got a brother, we're 3 years apart. Some of you are like, we've tried that. I got a brother, we're 3 years apart. I would love, when Kevin and I were fighting, to be able to say, you know what, I'm just going to call Jesus. Like, let's take this to Jesus, okay? It's the ultimate trump card. Like, oh, let's bring Jesus in on this. Well, that's what these two brothers do. Luke 12 says this, verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Man, this is something that brothers, as they get older, deal with. How are we splitting the money our parents left us? I love Jesus' response here. And as we're going through this conversation about God's heart for the poor, notice what Jesus says behind what he says. Because Jesus says, man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you? It's Jesus' subtle but not so subtle way of saying, if I pick one of you over the other, I'm going to offend you. I'm going to offend one of you if I side with one or the other. And your parents know this, right? There's certain things, like if you come to them as siblings, like, I'm not getting involved in that. But Jesus says, I'm not going to pick one or the other. Guess what? Because I have something to say about the stuff that you want that's actually going to offend both of you. Do you see the poor? And Jesus, very subtly but not so subtly, is asking these two brothers, what does he say? Verse 15, take care and be on your guard, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Doesn't that just cut against the grain in everything you believe deep down? That your life does not consist in the abundance of the things you have. And let's just talk about not the things you left at home, but the things you brought with you that are in this room. You have more technology in your pocket than the Apollo program used to put a man on the moon. And do you know how much the Apollo program cost? Billions of dollars. And Jesus says, take care, be on your guard, because your life does not consist in these things. And this is one thing that we can learn from the poor. Do you see the poor? It's also a question of, can you learn from the poor? And here's the thing. The poor realize that your life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions. The poor have something to teach the church. Jesus tells a story. I love that Jesus, and it cuts against the grain a little bit with me, but Jesus says, you know what? I'm going to tell you a story. Jesus doesn't pull up a chalkboard. Jesus doesn't open up a budget book. He doesn't open up a finance book and saying, like, here's how you can split your inheritance well. No. He says, I'm actually going to say something that's going to offend both of you. Your relationship with your brother is more important than the possessions that you have. The people, the family that you have is more important than the things that may split you apart. And he told him a parable. He told him a story with a meaning. So follow along with me. Verse 16. The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. Hold on for a second. He said he had nowhere to store his crops. You know what was a perfectly acceptable alternative? He could share his crops. But he doesn't say that. So he makes a move. Why do we miss the poor? We miss the poor because our eyes see what our heart loves. And what we love is not just stuff, but it's what our stuff we think brings us, and that's comfort and control. And we're on this road to getting to God's heart to the poor, and we're talking about what keeps us from seeing the poor, what keeps you from seeing the poor in your life. And so this is what Jesus says. He tells us a story, and he goes, the guy goes, I have nowhere to store my crops. So he said, I will do this. I'm going to tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. Just a little comment. Jesus is not anti-stuff. He's not anti-things. The problem is that the man said, all my stuff is going in these barns. All his stuff. He's going to store it. He's not going to share it. He's not going to put some of it aside. He's going to put all of it aside. And many of us, this describes the path that you are about to go on. That's why I love this conversation. I'm looking at a room of people who are on the verge of buying into the script that the best thing in life for you is to get the bigger house, to get the better car, to trade it in to get a better car, and all of these things so that you could build a big barn so that you could start being generous at 75. And God's heart for the poor means that you don't have to wait for your will to be generous. That God's will is that you be generous with what you have right now. We're going to address that, so just hang on to that a minute, because I got $10 in my bank account. This doesn't apply to me at all. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. But this is what he says. Notice what he says to himself, right? There's no other person in this conversation. He's completely blind to how other people might benefit from the excess that he has. He says to himself, soul. How you doing, soul? Relax. Hey, soul, kick up your feet. Relax, he says. You have ample goods laid up for many years. Does this not describe how we use our American freedom? Does this not describe that? I said to my soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool. See, in our culture, we don't call that guy a fool. Let's be clear. We give that guy the seat, the front row seat everywhere. We give that entrepreneur and that businesswoman the front row seat everywhere. They get the YouTube influence. They get the Instagram influence. They get it, and they look super successful. And God looks at that person and says, you fool. And it's not because they have stuff. It's because what God says next. Fool, this night, your soul is required of you. And the things you've prepared, who are they going to? Who's getting it? Do you see the poor? Do you see God's heart for the poor? We're blind to God's heart for the poor because we believe that our comfort matters more. But that's foolish. Let me illustrate what this looks like. Guys, I'm excited about this because I'm a history geek, and I found a way to talk about the Titanic in this lesson. So just bear with me. Some of you need to know the Titanic is not just a movie, it really happened. The Titanic is real. I've got a picture of it to prove it. That's all right. There it is. There it is. Somebody's like, liar. There it is. Now, on the Titanic, I actually did the math, and we don't have time to go into it, but a first-class ticket and a first-class suite on this boat would put you back almost $115,000 in today's money. But you know how much a third-class ticket costs? It costs more than the average annual salary of the common man in 1912. The people literally put multiple years of their savings just at a shot to come to America. But here's what you need to know about the Titanic. Just like Jesus' parable, it says, you fool. The rich and the poor, all on this boat, ended up in the same place. They ended up at the bottom of the ocean. They ended up with all of their artifacts littering the bottom of the Atlantic floor. And what people love is they love to go down to this wreck and they love to collect the artifacts of rich people. I've watched a lot of documentaries on this, and you know what they're always fascinated about? They're always fascinated about finding the stuff the rich people have. No one's interested in just the poor man's shoes. They're interested in the stopwatch that Jacob Astor had, or Benjamin Guggenheim. And you don't even know these people, right? But it would be the equivalent of Elon Musk dying on his way to Mars. That's the equivalent. It was people that famous that went down on this boat. And in a moment, the entire world was suddenly reckoning with this simple fact of, oh my goodness, what I have does not keep me from condemnation. It doesn't keep me from death. And that's why God is looking at this person saying, you fool. This is what Jesus says. The things you've prepared, who will they be? Verse 21, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. God cares about being rich so long as we're rich towards him. And so this question of how do we see the poor, we first have to take the log out of our own eye and say, there's a reason we don't see the poor. It's not because they're not around us. It's because we don't want to see the poor. It's because we don't want to see God's heart. We don't want to see it. Because if we see it, like I'm going to show later, when you see poverty, when you close your proximity to people, proximity breeds empathy. We would start to understand poverty better, not if we read more economics books, but if we started to live our lives amongst the poor. And that's the heart of Jesus. That's the heart of God. I want to throw up a quick quote by someone we all know and love, because as Ace Ventura, he performed childish humor. This is what Jim Carrey says. I wish everyone had fame and money so they realize it's not the answer. I wish everyone realized it. And guess what? So this is why I love talking to this room and this crowd in particular, is because, guys, some of you are on the verge of buying into it. Quite literally. And you've been made promises that, hey, this is going to be the salary you'll get, and this will be the cars you'll get, and this will be the joy and the happiness. But here's something I'd like you to consider. We say that money buys happiness, but you know what oftentimes we also say? Is we say, we won't really talk about money. Anyone heard that before? We don't really talk about money. It's just kind of like, it's vain. It's not appropriate. You ever gone to someone's house like, how much did this house cost? How much do you lease that Mercedes out front? I kid you not, this happened in my home growing up. One of our friends at church drove a nice car that was named after a kind of cat. And it was parked outside of our house. This church member came to visit us. And a person I knew walked in case they walk. I don't want to ruin anyone's relationship. I did not ask permission to share the story. So this is just to illustrate the point. She walks around. She didn't know we had company. She walks in our house and goes, who do you know that owns a Jaguar? And then she turned around and said, oh, because most of us are comfortable with this idea that money is vain and we don't really like to talk about it. And guess what happens? When we don't see the poor, we hold that over them as well. You really shouldn't talk about money. The difference between the poor is that money is not for luxury, it is for living. It is for living. And when we miss God's heart for the poor, we spiritualize money to the point where we look and we say, you know what, we should really just care less about money. You try telling that to someone who can't make ends meet and they want to feed their family. Seeing the poor means closing the gap, being in proximity with them enough to understand, yes, they have dignity, and yes, their problems maybe you don't have, but at the same time, in the kingdom of Jesus, the problems of your neighbor become your problems. Do you see the poor? Now, you may be saying, look, I'm a college student and you still haven't convinced me that this applies to me at all because I got $10 in my bank account. And you're like, this doesn't apply to me. I want to challenge you with something because we've already kind of poked the monster a little bit. We've already kind of poked the elephant in the room. You may not be rich in funds, but you still are rich in assets. That just like poverty is not just an economic conversation about dollar signs, so too that your rich or poorness is not a direct reflection of the money you have in your bank account. The support of your parents, whether you have that or not, some of you in this room do. The fact of whether or not you have a car that you're not making car payments on, right? The fact that maybe you pay less rent, but you earn an apartment. Maybe you have a food. Here's the question. God's heart for the poor does not demand that you have a certain amount of zeros in your bank account. It demands you say, how can I be generous with the things that I have right now? You don't have to wait to be generous. Our culture celebrates generosity with people who donate 0.0000 to the local NPR station or to the local PBS. But what the people of God have done, and that you may say, how does this apply to me? What I'm going to invite you to do tonight, you say, I've never heard this before. I've never heard that Jesus cared about my generosity even when I don't have money. That he cares about my generosity with the things that I have, with where I'm at right now. That hospitality and generosity in the kingdom of God and God's heart to the poor is not a reflection of what the church has or doesn't have. It's an expression of what we do have. You're like, how does this apply to me? I've never heard this teaching before. I've never heard that church is like, and here's what I'd like. Can I just share this with you for a second? That the history of the church has always had a faithful few who've continued the way of Jesus described here, where he says, further on down, he says this, verse 32, fear not, little flock. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. It's his good pleasure. And we need to understand this, right? That the kingdom of God is received by open hands and hearts. And so if you're holding on to something, it doesn't matter how much that thing has value on eBay or Amazon, the hold it has over your heart, as you release that, you allow God to put in your hand the kingdom. His rule, his reign expressed in these ways. And what I want to invite you to do tonight, regardless of how much money you have in your account, is to see God's heart for the poor, to see that they have dignity, and to step into that. And you say, well, what does that look like? I want to put two images in your mind. A table and a hospital. If you've ever eaten at someone's table in their house before, and if you've ever gone to a hospital, if you've ever gone to a doctor's office, you are the benefit of the church's obedience throughout history. So what about the table? In 30 to 40 years after Jesus left the earth, right, he ascended to the throne, he's about to sit down, he's reigning already, but not quite yet, right? We're getting to the world he's bringing, but it's not quite here yet. 30 years after Jesus ascends, there's a problem, and Jesus is teaching about poverty and about our relationship to our possessions. It was so radical that the early church missed it. They needed help. They needed it reclaimed, because you know what happened? Early church met in houses. And in 1 Corinthians 11, one of the early church leaders calls out the church that was meeting in this city and said, what are you doing? And let me just put it in our practice, in our day and age, okay? If you work an hourly job, you know that sometimes you don't get off at 5 like salaried workers. Right? Pretty basic. So what if I told you the most normal thing in the world is, hey, sometimes hourly workers, yeah, you're eating at 8, 8:30, 9 o'clock. You're grabbing McDonald's on the way home. It's when you eat. Well, those who are salaried, who have that privilege in their life to have a salary job, they get off at 5. Guess what? They're eating at 5:30. Well, guess what? The early church, it was so comfortable to them. It was so cultural for them that they just absorbed the practice of the culture around them. And guess what? They started taking communion. Rich in this room, poor in this room. Rich early, poor late. And suddenly the very house where this church, this people of God was supposed to gather in unity, were being divided by socioeconomic status. And guys, they weren't making a choice. It was just a subconscious, like, this is just what we do in the world. Like, the poor in our city, they get off at whatever time it is, and they're late. And we already got started. And Paul calls them out. He says, this should not be. We're talking about the kingdom coming and Jesus' heart for the poor. And this is what we need to understand. The sign of kingdom come is when it doesn't matter about your socioeconomic status, that everyone has a seat at Jesus' table. That's one of the signs of kingdom come. This is the tradition. This is the stream that we as the church run in. That God's heart for the poor, it doesn't, hear me, it doesn't begin by the dismantling or by the reformation of political structures. It begins with the responsibility of the church to be a countercultural witness in the midst of the society, whatever society we find ourselves in. And that's true of communist Russia, and that's true of the capitalism in America. The church is responsible to take every socioeconomic reality and say, look, it doesn't matter how much we make. We share more in Jesus than what divides us in our bank accounts, than what divides us in our jobs, and none of that comes into play. And God's heart for the poor is seen in that. But there's not just a table, there's a hospital. About 300 years later, I want to give a lot of credit to Matt. Matt is a classics major at the University of Mary Washington. I told Matt, hey, we're talking about this stream that followed the way of Jesus and took the way of Jesus throughout all of history to show God's heart for the poor in each and every situation of their day. And guys, the banks of that river follow along the Roman Empire early on. That was the world that the Christians navigated. So I asked Matt, we're going to talk a little bit about an early church hero of mine. Could you give me some background on the Roman economic and class system? I got 6 pages. I don't have time to get through everything he gave me. But here's one clear thing that I saw. That in Rome, there was such a wealth disparity between the rich and the poor. There was no middle class. It was either you had or you had not. And here's the thing. Here's one of the things about America, right? When we look at someone who dies poor, we say, you did something wrong. Because we live in a society where we have this semblance of upward mobility. Subconsciously, many of you believe that. It's okay if you're born poor. It's not okay if you die poor. But in Rome, that was not really a reality. You were born poor and you died poor. There was no upward mobility. You were either born into it or somehow you got a ton of money and bought your way into it, but that was incredibly unlikely. And so what happened was around 300s, there was this massive famine. And the rich people in Caesarea, this Roman city, the rich actually started fixing the price of grain and holding the grain literally in their barns. And Basil looked around and said, this is not the way of Jesus. So you know what Basil did? Basil founded what became known as the Basiliad. I don't think he named it after himself. I don't think he was that vain, okay? But you know what it was? It was a community. It was a community where healthcare was provided for people who couldn't afford healthcare. Healthcare used to be an elite privilege. And he brought healthcare to the masses. It was a place for people on the margins to come. They did employment training. They did job training. And many of us may push back against it and say, how is that connected to the gospel? James 2:16 simply says this: if you welcome your brother who is in need and says, go and be blessed, while he doesn't have a coat to keep him warm, James says, your faith is dead. Faith without works is dead. If we look at our brother in need and say, oh, go be warm, be blessed, brother, without doing something for them, we show that our faith, our gospel faith, is disconnected from our love for neighbor, our love for image bearers. If we know our king, we know our king's heart for image bearers, and we cannot stand back. So a sign of the kingdom at tables is that no matter your socioeconomic status, you have a place at the table. There's no partiality in the Church of Jesus. But another sign of the kingdom that Basil showed us in his pursuit of this hospital, this hospital that we have all benefited from, this great line of stream of thinking, is simply this: that in every age, a sign of kingdom come is when the church takes up the causes and the hurts of the marginalized, the oppressed, and the poor. And this is not a departure from the gospel. This is an outpouring of it. Jesus himself said that he who believes in me, out of his heart will flow streams of living water. It is an expression, an outflow of our faith in Jesus when we love our neighbor as ourselves. So what does this mean for us tonight? I bring us back to our original question. Do you see the poor? And for Basil in 300s in Caesarea, he was living in a different time, different culture. But guess what? There were many similarities. I want to give you an imagination to help you understand that God's heart for the poor extends just beyond the panhandler standing in the median in downtown Fredericksburg this weekend. Do you see the poor? Do you see the immigrant beyond just their status as undocumented or documented? Do you see the refugee? Do you see the single parent? Do you see the foster parent or the foster daughter or the foster son? Do you see? Do you see? Because you can see and not see, Jesus says. You can hear and not hear. And the question is not so much, do you see the poor? The question is, do you see Jesus? Because Jesus tells of a time where we'll stand before him and he says, blessed are you. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. And those will say to him, Lord, when did we see you in prison? When did we give you drink? And I say, truly, Jesus will reply to them, when you did it to the least of these, it was as if you did it to me. We don't do that to earn God's love and favor and grace. We do that because we've received it. The measure that we use is to be the measure that is applied to us. Do you see the poor? Do you see the disabled? Do you see the working poor? And many of us would rather throw stones, would rather choose to blame a system, would rather choose so many other distancing techniques. We hate social distancing, but guys, we really do love distancing from the commands of Jesus. And if you're uncomfortable, I'm glad, because guys, I got to tell you something. This was not easy for me to do. And I don't mean that to put myself up here as a victim. I'm telling you, I sit under this and it weighs on me. It weighs heavy on me, because the last question I want to ask you is, you see the poor maybe tonight, good. Maybe for the first time in your life, you're just kind of trying to, the wheels are beginning to turn. That my first reaction to someone is not, why are you lazy? Why do you not have money? Why are you in your 40s and 50s and you don't have anything to your name right now? Like, what is wrong with you? That your first reaction may not be that. Your first reaction is, this person is made in the image of Jesus, and I want to gain proximity to them so I can be in presence with them, so their problems can become my problems. And not because we want to fix something temporal, but because we want something eternal for them, and that is their entry into the kingdom of Jesus. And Jesus says this, truly, truly, I say to you, it is harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for the poor. That the poor have something to teach the church. Because their heart, Jesus says, is blessed because they are poor, and the kingdom of heaven is for them. They have something to teach us. Do you see the poor? Maybe you see the poor. Well, the next question, the final question I have for you tonight is simply this. Do you want to feel good or do you want to do good? Do you want to feel good? Then go give money to a soup kitchen. You'll feel good. You want to feel good? Continue doing ministry by proxy. That's what James says. True religion, pure, undefiled from God's eyes, is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. And it's a present. Some of us want to advocate for the poor, but we don't want to be present with the poor. And I'm telling you, the only way that you can advocate is if you're in the middle of it. And where do we learn that? We don't learn that from political theory. We don't learn that from democratic socialism. We don't learn that from communism. We don't learn that from capitalism. You know where we learn that? We learn that from a God who stood in the throne of heaven and said, I'll give this up. I will give up my privilege. I will give up my right. I will come into that. Oh, guys, we sit as a church under condemnation, and I want to share something with you, because I lived in New Orleans for 5 years. I didn't live through Katrina, but I lived and ministered in a community that was not the same socioeconomic strata as I was raised in, and nor was it representative of the socioeconomic. It wasn't homogeneous, okay? You crossed one street, it was multi-million-dollar homes. You crossed to the other side of the street where our church was, and it was low-income apartments. And guys, I want to share this with you to know that, like, I've struggled with this. I've sit under this as needing much of the teaching of Jesus as you do. Because there was one evening where a church family called me their pastor. And they said, hey, we can't make our rent this month. I said, oh, hey, I'm going to put my wife in the car. We're gonna go get you groceries. And you know what? We're even going to get you a pizza. And we pull up to their house. They're not there. They work multiple jobs. Their kids came out. Their kids were a couple years younger than me. And I watched my wife and I backed our car up. We flipped up the trunk and we started handing the groceries over. And guys, to my shame, I was angry. I was mad. I got in the car. I don't even know if I told my wife it or not, but I said to my soul, soul, they were so ungrateful. They never said thank you. And I sat there long enough and I realized that what God was trying to do was not get me to help someone. They needed to help me. They needed to help me see that I cared more about being recognized. That generosity for me was not a reflex, it was a pretext. That I wanted to be the Christian that was known for helping the poor. That I wanted to be the one with the reputation. And then Jesus said, Jared, did I not tell you that in my kingdom, my economy is advanced when Jesus' people, when you give with your left hand and your right hand doesn't even know what it's doing. You don't give without any thought of reward, that it's just a reflex. You don't give for someone's thank you. You give because you've been given, Jared. And I sat into that. I sat under condemnation. And it was after that moment that I realized, not that I needed to go and find the quickest charity to give money to make myself feel better. I knew that the only way fundamentally to respond to God's heart from the poor is to repent. And then to commit to living a life of faith, where we still stumble. That's what cancel culture can't deal with faith. Because cancel culture can't handle forgiveness. But I sat there and I handed that food to them. And I said, I wanted recognition that night. But what God wanted me to do was to recognize them. And through great pain, he opened my eyes. And in the church and in the kingdom of Jesus, we are called never to show partiality. And the simple fact was that night, guys, if they had showed up at church the next Sunday, my soul would have said, you know what? You're not grateful. You should probably just sit a little farther away. And yet what I've come to know of our King is that our King is so gracious. And it's not just that he says it to others, guys. He says it to me. I'm so glad you're here. Come have the front seat. That's the King. That's what the King says to you tonight. Come have the front seat. Come, he says to the rich young ruler, come, sell everything you have and come and follow me. And it says the rich young ruler went away sorrowful. Why? Was Jesus teaching salvation by works? No. He was teaching that if you want to receive the kingdom of God, it's worth giving up everything for. What he was calling that man to was repentance and faith, surrender. So I don't know who I'm talking to tonight. I venture there's a couple of rich young rulers and there are people who say, you know what? Jesus, you want me to get rid of something? I don't really want to get rid of it. I'd rather just give money to the poor and be that person. I'd say to you, you're missing out. You're missing out today. And my worry, my concern, my fear is that you may miss out on the kingdom, because if you hold on to this world, you cannot receive what Jesus has for you. You can't receive his forgiveness. You can't receive his love. You can't receive his grace. And to those of you who are on the verge of taking Jesus seriously, we're on the verge of saying, you know what, poverty is not just poor in spirit. While it is that, it is also literally my presence among the poor. And then it starts here among us in our church, in this place. To those of you who are on the verge, I simply just asked this question that Jesus asked me very gently with authority all those years ago in New Orleans. Jesus says to me, Jared, do you want to feel good or do you want to really do good? And doing good means you got to do good like I do good. And that means to become one and show solidarity with the people that I love.